Marisol arrived at Willow Fallow just before dawn, the sky above still faint with that particular shade of violet that only lasts a breath between night and morning. The world was suspended in silence, and for a long moment, she stood outside the wrought iron gates with her hands pressed flat against their cool, rust-streaked bars. The hinges groaned when she pushed them open. The sound startled a pair of crows perched on the skeletal frame of an old windmill, their wings rising into the hush with the dry rustle of brittle parchment. She watched them vanish into the dim light, then stepped forward, her boots crunching over the frost-laced gravel path that led to the farmhouse. She carried nothing with her but a cloth sack worn thin at the corners, a tattered prayer book bound in cracked leather, and a single locket on a fraying chain tucked beneath the collar of her coat. It was not much, but it was all that remained of the world she had known. And for now, it had to be enough. The Orphan farm was still and gray, touched by the breath of winter that lingered too long for a spring morning. The fields, once green and full of promise, lay barren now, long rows of cracked, brittle soil stretching like ribs across the land. A rusted plow leaned forgotten against the side of a tool shed, and a wheelbarrow with one splintered handle had sunk half into the mud by the chicken coop, as if the earth itself had begun to reclaim what no longer served. She passed them quietly, not yet ready to disturb the stillness with footsteps that felt foreign even to her. In the hush, she heard only the distant whimper of wind threading through barn rafters and the soft creak of it settling beneath its own weight. The house at the center of the farm was modest and weather-worn. Its white paint had long since peeled away, revealing the bleached gray of old cedar beneath. A porch stretched across the front, its boards warped and softened with rot, and a single rocking chair stood motionless beside the door, its seat thick with dust. She did not go inside. Not yet. Instead, she turned off the path and moved toward the barn, her feet dragging through a scatter of straw and wind-blown leaves. There, just beyond the gatepost, grew a rose bush, or what had once been one. Its branches were twisted and brittle, bowed under the weight of seasons without rain. No blossoms adorned it now. Only thorns and the withered ghosts of last year's leaves clung to its spindly limbs. But she knelt beside it anyway, brushing her fingers lightly across the cold soil at its base as if touching the hand of an old friend. Then, bowing her head, she closed her eyes and whispered the first prayer she'd spoken aloud in over 6 months. The words came hesitantly, as though each one had to be coaxed from the dry well of her throat. Her voice, thin and tremulous, barely stirred the silence. They were not prayers she had learned from any priest or formal text, though she held the battered prayer book open across her lap. These were fragments stitched together from memory and longing, phrases her mother used to murmur while folding linens or kneading dough, and lines her father had once sung beneath his breath while carving a wooden spoon. Their voices were long gone now, but they lived on the cadence of her own, shaped by grief and softened by time. She prayed not for miracles, not for thundercloud or angels or the sudden righting of all wrongs. She asked only for the soil to remember the shape of water, for the wind to carry mercy instead of dust, for the children inside that house, children she had not yet seen, to know something gentler than hunger. She prayed for the rose bush to bloom again, not because it would feed them, but because beauty might still grow from broken roots. She prayed for the strength to stay, when every instinct told her to run. When the words ran out, she remained kneeling in silence, her knees numb by the cold earth, her hands folded loosely in her lap. A thin shaft of sunlight had begun to slide across the barn wall, catching on the glass shards embedded in the mortar there, remnants of an old window long since shattered. The light fractured as it passed, scattering like dandelion seeds across the ground and briefly illuminating the rose bush in a pale golden glow. Marisol opened her eyes. The bush had not changed, of course. Its limbs remained dry, its thorns sharp and bare. But for one fragile moment, it appeared to shimmer with something that might have been possibility. She rose slowly, her limbs stiff, her breath leaving her in a visible plume. The quiet of the place pressed in around her again. There was a loneliness here that did not feel empty, exactly. More like an absence that had grown roots, a silence that held the shape of all who had left. It clung to the fence posts and the corners of the barn door. It lived in the hush between creaks of the floorboards. And now, It wrapped itself around her as if testing the weight of her presence. Inside the farmhouse, the air was heavy with the scent of wood smoke and soap. The kitchen was dim but clean, with a pot resting on the stove and a handful of enamel cups arranged on the counter. A basket of laundry sat half-folded on the table, and boots were lined neatly against the wall near the door. Someone had been tending this place, even if time and hardship had left their marks. A dog-eared calendar hung beside the pantry, still flipped to a month 3 pages behind. She set her sack on a chair and moved through the rooms in silence, her footsteps muffled by a threadbare rug. The sound of breath, small, slow, and scattered, drifted down from the second floor. The children were still asleep. She would meet them later. For now, she did not disturb their rest. Instead, she returned to the porch and sat in a rocking chair, her back against the brittle slats, the locket resting in her palm. It was a simple piece, oval, tarnished, the clasp bent from years of wear, but it still opened with a soft click, revealing 2 miniature portraits drawn in delicate strokes. Her mother, hair braided and eyes distant. Her father, smile half-formed, as if interrupted mid-thought. She touched their faces with the tip of one finger, then snapped the locket shut and let it hang again against her heart. She stayed there for some time, listening to the breath of the wind as it stirred the bare branches of the elm trees, to the rhythmic creak of the chair beneath her, to the subtle murmurs of a house, still learning how to trust her presence. She had been taken in with little ceremony, granted refuge by a distant cousin of her late mother's who had written only once, 3 lines on yellow paper. "We have need of hands. The roof still holds. Come if you wish." That had been enough. It was more than most received in these hard years. She had boarded the wagon with no promise of return, watching the smoldering remains of her childhood home disappear into the dust behind her. Loss, she had learned, did not always come with noise. Sometimes it arrived in silence, like a blanket drawn up too tightly against your skin. It suffocated slowly, wrapping itself around your ribs until your breath grew short and shallow, and you forgot how it once felt to live without the weight of it. But this place, though threadbare, though weary, held a different kind of silence. Not the silence of endings, but of waiting, a breath held just before song. Later, when the sun had climbed higher and the barn cast long shadows across the yard, the door above creaked open. A boy no older than 10 peered down, his hair matted on one side from sleep, his eyes wide and cautious. He said nothing, just stared. Marisol did not call out to him. She simply raised one hand in greeting, her fingers fluttering like leaves on the wind. The boy blinked once, then disappeared. A moment later, the sound of soft footsteps followed, more than one set, accompanied by the low murmur of hushed voices. They would come to know her in time, and she them, but for now, they were still strangers to one another, orbiting the same fragile place, tethered by circumstance and hope and a hunger for something more than survival. Marisol knew this hunger intimately. It was not only the hunger of the belly, though that, too, gnawed at her. It was a hunger to belong, to be seen without question, to be needed in some small, enduring way. She would tend this place with all she had. She would mend what could be mended, feed what could be fed, water what might still grow. And each morning, she would kneel by the rose bush and pray. Not because she believed the sky would split open or that rain would fall just for her, but because the act of asking still mattered. Because sometimes, all that kept the heart from hardening was a quiet insistence that something unseen might yet hear you. In the stillness of that first morning, with frost melting slowly from the windowsills and the smell of damp earth thick in the air, Marisol closed her eyes and breathed in the waiting. It filled her chest, tangled around her ribs, and held her gently as if to say, "Stay." In the weeks that followed her arrival, Marisol came to learn the ways in which a small, forgotten place teaches silence before speech. There was no grand welcome, no gathering of arms around her shoulders, no words of certainty or comfort. The Orphan farm operated on a rhythm carved not by joy but by habit, shaped by years of doing without, and the children who wandered its halls did so with the wary self-reliance of those who had long ago stopped expecting adults to stay. They watched her with the wide, quiet eyes of deer in winter, not frightened, but cautious. measuring whether she would leave like the others or simply fade into the fabric of the walls. Outside the fence, the land bore its own skepticism. Drought had turned the county into a palette of weary browns and grays, and what few patches of grass remained had curled into brittle husks under the weight of the sun. The trees along the dirt road into town stood with their arms outstretched, bare and beseeching, as though waiting for rain that never came. Each morning, Marisol would cross the yard of the barn, the soles of her boots stirring little whirlwinds of dust, and she would kneel at the rose bush, her knees pressing into the cracked earth that no longer smelled of soil but of ash. Her prayers, if they held any warmth, did not show it. They slipped into the wind like the echo of an old lullaby, half-remembered, imperfect, and, according to the townspeople, entirely pointless. The villagers had heard about her soon enough. It did not take long. News in dry country travels not by foot, but by thirst. The grocer, who once delivered day-old bread to the farm, mentioned a young woman with city softness in her hands and strange ideas in her voice. The minister's wife whispered about the girl who knelt in dirt instead of pews, who prayed without calling on any saint they recognized. Some found it amusing, others pitied her, but most simply dismissed her. "She's wasting breath," they muttered. "You can't pray water from stone." And, over time, they began to say it more loudly, with the certainty of those who had given up their own asking, and resent anyone who has not. Marisol never argued. She did not step into town to defend herself or try to explain why she prayed to a God whose name she no longer spoke aloud. She went into town only when she had to, when salt ran low, or when the last sack of flour left only dust on the shelf. She learned to listen without absorbing, to let the stairs pass through her like wind through a wheatless field. She would carry her sack on her back, gnawed at those who would not meet her eye, and walk the long road home as if the judgment behind her belonged to someone else's story. Inside the farmhouse, the days moved with a slow and careful grace. There were 6 children, all under the age of 12, each bearing their own quiet history, each orbiting the others with a kind of fragile wariness. Marisol did not try to lead them right away. She made no speeches, no demands. Instead, she filled the kettle at dawn and made tea from dried nettles and mint. She swept the corners of the house where cobwebs had long since claimed dominion. She mended the hem of May's coat without being asked, and when Leo broke the handle off the water pump, she showed him how to fix it with nothing more than a bit of wire and a patience he had never known from grown hands. By slow degrees, they began to let her in, not in grand gestures, but in moments so small they might have gone unnoticed had she not been paying attention. One afternoon, while peeling potatoes on the porch, she looked up to find little Clara asleep against the doorframe, her thumb curled against her lip, a single boot hanging loosely from her foot. Another day, she entered the barn to find that someone, likely Theo, the eldest, had left a cup of wild berries on the prayer book she kept beside the rose bush. She said nothing, only touched the rim of the cup in acknowledgement. These were not declarations of trust, but offerings, seeds of something fragile and slow-growing. Still, the drought did not relent. Each morning brought a deeper ache in the air, a stillness so profound it seemed to mute the very sound of birds. The hens stopped laying. The well grew shallower. The wooden rain barrel beside the barn lay cracked along the seam, and no one bothered to mend it because they knew there would be nothing left to catch. And yet, Marisol returned to the rose bush every day, her voice low, her fingers buried in the hard soil, as if the very act of touching the earth could coax life back into it. The children began to watch her from the shadows of the barn, curious but uncertain. May, the smallest, once asked in a whisper whether the rose bush remembered what blooming felt like. Marisol had crouched beside her, brushed the dust from the child's knees, and said, "Sometimes we forget what we were meant to be, but memory is stubborn, like roots." One evening, a windstorm rose suddenly from the west, sweeping across the fields with a rage that seemed born of desperation. The windows rattled. Dust blew under the doors and gathered in the corners like soot. The children huddled near the hearth, and Marisol moved through the rooms lighting candles, her locket heavy against her chest. She remembered then a similar windstorm from her childhood, when her father had carried her outside just before the rains broke, whispering that sometimes the sky screams before it weeps. But that night, The storm passed without weeping. No rain followed, only silence, thick and breathless, as if even the clouds had forgotten how to release what they carried. The next morning, the rose bush had lost one of its main branches. It lay broken in the dirt, its thorns dulled by dust, its core hollow and gray. Marisol picked it up with both hands, cradling it as one might a wounded bird, and laid it gently on the compost heap. The children watched her from the steps. None of them spoke, but their silence was different now. Not the silence of doubt, but of mourning. That week, the village council convened. They sent a letter written in tight, formal hand, warning the farm to prepare for rationing. The town's reserves would not stretch to cover those who had not paid their tithes. And the farm, with its overgrown fields and its orphan mouths, had not paid in over 2 years. Marisol read the letter in the dim light of the pantry, her breath shallow, her chest constricted by a familiar sense of helplessness. She tucked the paper into the folds of her skirt and did not show it to the children. Instead, she rose early the next morning, gathered what little remained in the larder, 2 onions, a few shriveled carrots, half a sack of lentils, and set about making enough stew to last 3 days. She added a pinch of thyme and a splash of vinegar, whispering a prayer not for more food, but for the taste of linger, for warmth to carry where fullness could not. That afternoon, when she carried the bowls out to the children gathered beneath the oak tree, she found Leo tracing lines in the dust with a stick. He looked up at her, face smeared with ash and worry, and asked plainly, "Why do you keep praying if nothing changes?" His voice was not mocking, only tired. Marisol crouched beside him, set the bowls down carefully, and said, "Because I'm not asking the world to change all at once, just enough to keep us trying." He didn't answer, but he nodded once, and that night, when she walked the rosebush, he followed her at a distance, hands in his pockets, eyes turned toward the sky. And so it went. The villagers continued to speak of her, though their tone grew sharper. One woman at the well declared, "That girl's making a fool of herself, talking to dead roots like they're listening." Another said, "It's not decent what she does. Those children need work, not wishes." But Marisol bore their scorn the way one bears weather, with the quiet resignation of someone who knows storms pass eventually. She did not speak against them. She did not defend her prayers. She only returned to the rose bush each day, knelt in the same spot, and whispered into the wind words that were no longer pleas, but something else entirely. A rhythm, a ritual, a way to remember that breath and belief can still coexist, even in silence. One morning, as she walked toward the barn, she heard a sound she had not heard in months. The soft creak of the gate being opened, not by her, but from the outside. She turned to see a man in a brown coat and wide-brimmed hat standing just beyond the fence line. He held a small parcel wrapped in oilskin and bore the air of someone who had not meant to be noticed. "For the children," he said, placing the bundle on the post. "And for whatever it is you're doing out here." Then he tipped his hat and turned away before she could reply. Inside the parcel were 2 loaves of bread and a pouch of dried apples. Marisol stood in the yard for a long moment, the scent of yeast and salt rising to her nostrils, and felt something shift beneath her ribs, not hope quite, but a loosening. Even in drought, she had come to understand, kindness could still fall like rain, not in torrents, not enough to fill a well. But sometimes, a single drop was enough to remind the heart how to thirst again. By the time the 3rd month wore its way across the bone-dry horizon, the rhythms of willow fallow had reshaped themselves to Marisol's quiet presence. Not by declaration or design, but in the way dust settles into corners and becomes part of the house. The children no longer flinched when she entered a room, nor did they stiffen when her footsteps approached across the creaking floorboards. They had not named their trust, nor offered it freely, but in small, unspoken gestures they began to share over the private textures of their days. Things once held in silence now stirred faintly in the air between them. Marisol moved through those moments with careful hands and gentler eyes, watching, listening, mending where she could, and holding her peace where she could not. She spent most mornings in the kitchen, sleeves rolled up to her elbows, coaxing meals from scant supplies with a kind of practiced grace. There was no bounty to work with, only a dwindling pantry and the odd forage root or herb brought in by Theo and Leo, who had begun venturing farther down into the wooded glens just past the edge of the parched farmland. They brought back bundles of nettles, early dandelion greens, even a few wild mushrooms once, their faces flushed with pride despite the filth on their boots and the weariness in their limbs. Marisol praised every contribution as if it were a feast, and the children began to look for things she might use. Bits of old string, splinters of wax, cracked eggshells she could crush for the compost. They had known hunger too long to pretend it wasn't there, but now they carried it together, made it into something just slightly more bearable by giving it form and purpose. The days, though harsh, were no longer shapeless. She had introduced stories into their evenings, drawing them from her own memory as well as from the yellowing books left behind by the farm's previous matron. The bookshelf in the parlor was missing more than half its teeth, the volumes scattered or lost, but enough remained to build a kind of scaffolding. After supper, once the bowls were scrubbed and the lamps lit, the children would gather in a loose semicircle around the hearth, some curled beneath patchwork quilts, others lying on their bellies across the floor. Marisol read slowly, her voice calm and low, shaping each word with care. Her favorite was a battered anthology of fables, its cover long gone, and its spine held together by a braided cord of ribbon and twine. Leo especially liked the story of the deer who carried a lantern through the fog to guide lost travelers home. Clara preferred the tale of the old woman who grew violets from tears. May, too young yet to understand all the words, seemed content just to listen, her head resting in Marisol's lap, eyes fluttering closed at the same point each night. But the stories were more than a comfort. They became part of the fabric of the farm, woven into how the children began to see their own lives. Theo, who had once refused to speak more than a few curt syllables, began drawing his own animals on scraps of paper torn from the margins of the almanac, inventing quiet, complicated worlds where foxes learned to sow and owls taught the wind to sing. He left these drawings tucked under Marisol's pillow without signing his name. She always found them with a kind of reverent quiet, smoothing the creases with her palms, then pinning them to the barn wall beside the prayer book she still kept by the rose bush. Her prayers, though unchanged in tone, began to fold these small acts into their rhythm. She did not pray just for rain anymore. She prayed for Leo's laugh, for Clara's steady hands, for the sound of little May humming to herself as she carried a tin pail across the yard, filled not with water, but with petals and pebbles and buttons the color of bone. It was in these days, among small and tender miracles, that Marisol began to write again. She had not kept a journal since before her parents' illness, when grief had turned even the simplest act of reflection into a kind of betrayal, a quiet cruelty of memory. But now she found herself craving the sound of pen against paper, the soft scratch of thought made real. She used a ledger she found buried in the back of the pantry, its columns once meant for crop rotations and harvest tallies. She ignored the lines and filled the pages with fragments instead, half prayers, half poems, observations of clouds and soil, and the way Clara's voice lifted like birdsong when she thought no one was listening. She wrote not because she hoped someone would one day read it, but because writing gave shape to what was otherwise invisible. It named the ache and the sweetness of the life she was rebuilding from splinters. In time, the barn became something more than storage and shelter. She swept out the stalls, patched the holes in the roof with old canvas, and hung Theo's drawings along the walls beside the rusting tools. She dragged an old armchair in from the back parlor, its stuffing torn and faded, but still soft in its bones. In the afternoons, when the sun beat down too hard and the air inside the farmhouse grew stifling, the children would gather there to read, to draw, to nap, to simply be. One day, Clara brought in a broken mirror she had found behind the chicken coop, and they propped it against a hayloft ladder. Its glass was cracked in 3 places, and the reflection it offered was fragmented. But they took turns peering into it, giggling at the way their faces warped and danced in the fissures. "It's magic," May whispered, tracing one fracture with her fingertip. Marisol said nothing, but she remembered how her mother had once called broken things holy because they still tried to hold a light. Still, there were moments when the weight of things pressed too tightly against the ribs. At night, when the children slept and the farmhouse settled into its groans and sighs, Marisol would sit alone on the porch with her shawl wrapped tight across her shoulders, the prayer book balanced on her knees. She did not always pray aloud. Sometimes she only listened. To the wind scraping dry branches against the roof, to the distant calls of coyotes, to the sound of her own heart beating slow and stubborn in her chest. She wondered, not for the first time, whether faith required belief or whether it could exist simply as a form of love for the land, for the children, for the act of hoping in spite of the evidence. One such night, a strange thing happened. She heard humming, not May's soft meanderings, but something fuller, older, threaded with melancholy. She followed it to barn and found Leo there, standing near the rose bush, singing to it. The moon hung low, casting silver across the dirt, and he stood barefoot, eyes closed, voice wavering between notes. She did not interrupt him. She only watched in the shadows, heart caught in her throat. When he finished, he turned, and though he startled to see her, he did not run. "I thought maybe," he said, voice barely above a whisper, "if you can pray, I can sing." She nodded, stepped beside him, and together they stood in silence, the bush between them bare and thorned, but not unloved. The drought still held. The days remained dry, the sun unyielding. But something else had begun to take root. Something not visible in the soil, but in the way the children's shoulders relaxed, in the way they began to speak to one another without fear, in the laughter that returned not as a trickle but as a stream. Marisol did not claim it as her doing. She believed only that perhaps her presence had cleared a path for the goodness already within them to rise, like seeds long buried, waiting not only for water, but for warmth, for hands to tend and eyes to see. The townspeople, meanwhile, remained unmoved. If anything, their comments grew colder. Some said Marisol was filling the children's heads with nonsense, distracting them from learning trades, from growing up hard and fast like the rest of them. Others accused her of harboring delusions, of making a spectacle of faith that bore no fruit. But even they could not help but notice the change in the children when they passed by the gate, how their eyes shone differently, how they stood taller, how they greeted strangers not with suspicion, but with wary kindness. "She's got them dreaming," one man muttered at the feed store, "and dreams don't feed mouths." But another, older woman, whose own boy had once been housed at Willow Fallow, only replied, "Maybe not, but neither does fear." And so the chapter deepened, not with rain, not with bounty, but with a quiet, deliberate claiming of life in the absence of ease. Marisol did not call herself a mother, nor did the children give her any name beyond her own, but the threads between them had tightened into something not unlike family, the kind made not by blood, but by proximity to love. Each of them still carried a memory of abandonment, of sorrow, of hunger that gnawed at more than the belly. But now, around the rose bush and inside the barn, they also carried something else, a form of hope that did not rely on miracles, but on daily offerings, a story shared, a meal stretched, a song sung to bare branches. And even though the rose bush remained stubborn in its dormancy, each child took a turn watering it with what little they could spare. A ladle of dishwater, a few drops from a chipped mug. It was not enough to revive anything, but it was enough to say, "We have not forgotten how to believe." Even here, even now, it began as a whisper in the coop, one of those sounds that comes not loudly, not with drama, but with a soft, unmistakable shift in rhythm, like a breath drawn more deeply than the others. Marisol heard it while crossing the yard with her arms full of laundry, the wind tugging hem her apron, and the sun already high enough to bleach color from the sky. The air was thick with dust and the heat that clung to every surface like a second skin, but that whisper, that faint rustling behind the old warped door of the henhouse, pulled her gaze and stilled her steps. For a long moment she simply listened, the sheets in her arms warming in her grasp, her heart reluctant to leap at the sound. Hope, she had come to learn, was a delicate thing. It could be starved by disappointment, made feral by false alarms. But the sound came again, a soft clucking, almost apologetic, followed by the shuffle of feathers and something she had not heard in many weeks, movement born of purpose. She set the laundry down carefully on the porch bench and walked toward the coop, each step slow, measured, her breath held without her noticing. The door groaned on its hinges when she opened it, and inside, the air was close with a familiar smell of straw and the sharp tang of feathers. For a second, her eyes struggled to adjust to the gloom, Then she saw her, the old barred rock hen, the one the children called Agnes, hunched in the corner atop a nest of loosely arranged hay, her body curved protectively, her black and white feathers fluffed as if trying to hold warmth in the still, heavy heat. Marisol crouched low, resting one hand against the wall to balance herself, and watched. Agnes blinked slowly at her, made no effort to move away, did not peck or squawk or raise alarm. She simply shifted, just enough to reveal what lay beneath her. 3 eggs, round and mottled and real. Marisol's breath caught. She stayed crouched for a long while, staring at those pale, perfect shapes, as though they might vanish if she blinked too fast or moved too quickly. Her knees began to ache beneath her skirt, but she didn't rise. Instead, she bowed her head, not in prayer exactly, but in reverence. Life, quiet, unlikely, and unannounced, had returned not with fanfare, but with a warm body and 3 silent gifts. That evening, she gathered the children outside the coop just before supper, leading them across the yard without explanation. Their faces were puzzled, expectant, and slightly amused by the mystery of it, until she opened the door and beckoned them in. They clustered close, shoulder to shoulder, their dusty feet scuffing at the straw. And when Agnes stirred again and the eggs came into view, a hush fell over them. Even Theo, who rarely showed much of anything in his expression, let out a quiet, awed breath. Clara leaned forward slowly, as if afraid to startle the miracle, while Leo looked up at Marisol with a look so wide it seemed to split him open. May clapped once, then caught herself and held her small hands over her mouth, giggling behind them. Marisol didn't say a word. She let them look, let them gather the meaning on their own, the way she had. After a few moments, she stood and backed out of the coop, motioning for them to follow. As they walked back across the yard, the light behind them stretched long and golden, softening the edges of the dry grass and the sagging fence line. It was a kind of light that made even the weary things beautiful, casting shadows that felt gentle rather than grim. When they reached the porch, she turned to them and said, "We'll give them time. No touching. Not yet. But every morning we'll check. And we'll thank her." No one questioned who the her was meant to be, Agnes the hen or something larger. That night, the children were restless with excitement. They invented stories about what color the chicks would be, who would get to name them, whether they lay golden eggs or sing lullabies. May insisted one would be hers and whisper its name into Marisol's ear like a secret too sacred to share. Marisol let them dream. She listened, nodded, smiled at their wonder, but inside her, something older stirred, something closer to awe than joy, not just because of the eggs themselves, but because of what they signaled. That life still remembered them. That something in the world had responded, not to her prayers necessarily, not in the way she had imagined, but to their persistence, to their staying, to the tending. That mattered more than she could say. In the days that followed, the children took turns visiting the coop. They approached it as one might a chapel, quietly, reverently, whispering greetings to Agnes and watching, breath held, as the eggs remained warm and whole beneath her. Marisol noticed how they began to treat other things with new care. Clara cleaned the windows with a scrap of old curtain, even though the dust would soon return. Theo spent an afternoon patching the barn door with leftover nails and salvaged wood, his face grim with concentration. Leo began waking earlier, sometimes even before Marisol, to sweep the kitchen and set out mugs for tea. It was as if the eggs had given them permission to believe again, not just in chickens or farming or even in luck, but in the idea that what they nurtured might one day bloom. One morning, as Marisol reached beneath Agnes to gently rearrange the nest, she found a 4th egg, smaller than the others, a soft pale blue, tucked beneath the edge of the straw as though uncertain whether it belonged. She held it in her palm for a long moment, marveling at the fragile perfection of it, then returned it to the nest with the same care she might have given a newborn. That afternoon, she wrote in her journal, "Asters, the earth is not deaf, only slow." And maybe mercy is not a storm, but a single egg in a hollow of a desperate season. Asterisk. Word of the laying hens reached the village before long. Nothing escaped notice for long in a town so tightly wound around the slow rhythm of scarcity. A woman at the well asked her, "What did you feed them?" with suspicion masked as curiosity. Another neighbor commented dryly, "Must be nice, your hen's still working while the rest of ours just sit there waiting to die." Marisol offered no defense. She did not speak of the prayers, the tending, the whisperings of children and songs sung by moonlight. She only said, "We're grateful," and walked away. But inside her something settled, not with pride but with certainty. What had begun as longing was becoming something rooted, something neither drought nor doubt could undo. The eggs became their own form of currency, though none were traded or sold. They were boiled and halved, shared carefully among the children in the simplest breakfast imaginable: salt, a drop of vinegar, and bread soaked in broth. One egg between three, split with the precision of reverence, consumed with a silence that was almost liturgical. May once asked if they could save a shell, and Marisol said yes. She cleaned it, dried it, and strung it on a thread to hang near the hearth. Soon, more joined it, until the wall bore a soft garland of empty vessels. Fragile trophies of endurance, reminders of what persistence can yield. It changed something in the air of the house. The children still went hungry some days, still watched the skies for clouds that never came, but now their hunger came with the memory of something given. Their waiting no longer felt empty. It was a change too subtle for the village to see, too small for anyone outside their gate to name, but echoed in the way they moved, in the way they touched each other's shoulders and laughed without apology, in the way Theo sat beside Clara while she stitched the hem of his trousers and didn't flinch when her hand brushed his, in the way Leo offered Marisol the last piece of bread without a word and meant it. Late one evening, as the fire crackled low and the children slept curled beneath quilts that still smelled faintly of sun-dried linen, Marisol sat alone in the kitchen and traced the outline of yolk left in a chip bowl. She did not cry, though tears had once come easily to her in the dark. Instead, she lit a single candle and whispered a prayer not for rain or rescue, but for more mornings like this. Mornings where something cracked open. Mornings where silence yielded to small songs. Mornings where children learned that love sometimes was a face of hen and the shape of an egg nestled in straw. When she finally went to bed, she left the candle burning. Just one flame. A reminder to the night that they were still here, still tending, still hoping. And somewhere outside, beneath feathers and hay, something warm waited to hatch. The sickness came like a whisper, barely noticed at first. It was May who carried it in her breath, a breath that had grown shallow, uneven, filled with small sighs too quiet to alarm. She was the smallest of the children, the lightest footed, the one whose humming threaded through every corner of willow fallow, like a trail of dandelion fluff on the wind. But in the days leading up to the fever, the hum vanished, and in its place came stillness, a stillness Marisol recognized not as calm, but as retreat. At first it was a refusal to eat more than a few mouthfuls of broth, then the way her eyes lingered too long on nothing in particular, as if her mind were folding inward. One morning, when Marisol reached to braid May's hair, her fingers brushed the child's forehead and found it hot, far too hot, the kind of heat that rises from the skin not in warmth, but in warning. She carried May upstairs in her arms, though the child was too old now to be lifted often. Her limbs were limp, her breath a thin whistle through parted lips, and her head rolled gently against Marisol's collarbone as they climbed the narrow steps. The locket around Marisol's neck thudded softly against her chest with each step, a metronome counting time in fragments of dread. The bed they placed May in was too big for her alone, but the other children had offered it without question, moving to the floor on quilts and hay-filled cushions without complaint. They knew, perhaps before words were given to it, that something in their small, enclosed world was tipping. Marisol soaked a rag in cool water and lay across May's brow, whispering her name over and over in a voice not much louder than a breath. She lit a candle at the foot of the bed and kept it burning through the day and into the night, replacing it each time it dwindled. She brewed teas from the few dried herbs left in the pantry. Elderflower, yarrow, a sliver of dried bark whose name she had only half remembered from a book, but May did not wake to taste them. The child's face took on a strange stillness, her lashes dark against two pale cheeks, her lips drying and cracking like the soil outside. Each hour that passed hollowed something deeper in Marisol's chest. She kept her hands busy, wiping May's arms with damp cloths, spooning in drops of water, pressing prayers into her skin like salve. But her mind grew jagged at the edges, filling with half-formed memories of another bed, another fever, another hand held too late. On the second night, when the sun had bled out behind the hills and the sky hung black and airless above the roof, Marisol could no longer keep the tremor from her voice. The prayer she spoke then was not beautiful. It was not measured or gentle. It was raw, torn from the deepest hollow inside her, where grief and love had long since fused into something too wild to tame. She knelt beside May's bed with both hands wrapped around her locket, the chain digging into her palms, and she whispered every word she could remember, not only the prayers from her childhood, but the ones she had made up in her own language, words of pleading and promise, fragments of lullabies, the remembered cadence of her mother's voice singing to her in a kitchen long gone to ash. She told whatever force might still be listening that she had nothing else to offer, that if something had to be taken, let it not be this child, not this small body so filled with hope, not this voice that had only just learned to laugh without fear. She asked without shame for a miracle, not a rainstorm or revival, not the return of abundance, but one breath, one cool morning, one chance to see May's eyes open again. She wept, though she tried not to, and when she finished, she laid her head against a mattress and did not move until dawn pressed its dim hand against the window pane. When she woke, May's skin was no cooler, her breath no steadier. But there was something else, something that didn't quite register until hours later, when Marisol, in the act of wringing out the cloths for the 100th time, noticed that the candle had not burned down. The wax stood firm, the flame steady and full. She frowned at it, not quite daring to name what stirred in her chest. She checked the others she had lit through the night, each one the same, barely consumed, as if time had passed differently in that room. She touched the side of May's face and found it just slightly less searing than before. Not cool, but changed. That evening, the child stirred once beneath the blankets and turned her face toward the window, a faint wrinkle of recognition drawing her brows. For 2 more days the fever clung, but it no longer deepened. The children took turns keeping vigil, bringing cups of water and whispered stories. Clara recited the tale of the night bird with golden wings. Leo sang the song they'd once made up for the chicks. Theo carved a tiny wooden dove and placed it on the windowsill as if to invite hope into the room. And on the morning of the 6th day, when the wind rose suddenly outside and leaves swept across the yard in a rustling hush, May's eyes opened. They were not bright or full, but they were hers. She looked first at the ceiling, then at the candle, then at Marisol, whose breath caught so violently she had to turn away and grip the side of the bed for balance. When she turned back, May's lips parted and her voice, weak and reed-thin, croaked, thirsty. The room fell silent. The children outside the door heard and came running. Marisol wept into her hands. They brought water in a chipped mug, held it to May's lips, and when the girl drank, it was as if every dry thing inside the house softened, as though her survival had seeped into the walls and floorboards and made everything breathe again. Marisol did not sleep that night, nor the next. She sat beside the bed and kept watch even as May began to eat again, to speak in hushed fragments, to smile with her eyes even when her mouth remained too tired to follow. The fever had retreated like a tide, and in its wake, it left a kind of quiet reverence. The house moved gently, with the children tiptoeing around each moment like it might shatter. They whispered their gratitude in clumsy ways. Leo swept the front step every morning without being asked. Clara offered up her only bar of soap to wash May's linens. Theo brought in wildflowers on the riverbed and placed them in a chip jar beside the child's pillow. And Marisol, though hollow by exhaustion, carried a strange lightness inside her. Not joy, not even relief exactly, but something like astonishment. She thought often of that moment at the height of the fever, the feel of the locket clench in her hand, the candle that refused to burn down, the sense that the very air around May's bed had thickened into something sacred. She did not claim to understand what had happened. She did not know whether it had been the prayers or the tears, or simply the resilience of a child's body determined not to surrender. But something had shifted in her. She had faced the silence with all she had left, and something, somewhere had answered, not with thunder, but with breath. Weeks passed. May grew stronger. Her voice returned fully, her step steadied, her hum resumed. But something remained in her, a softness not of weakness, but of knowing. She often paused now to look out the window, as if remembering something only she had seen. Once, as Marisol tucked her into bed, May whispered, "When I was sick, I dreamed you were singing, but your voice wasn't alone. There were others." Marisol smoothed her hair and kissed her forehead, unable to speak for a moment. Later that night, she opened her journal and wrote, "Asterisk, sometimes we survive because someone listens. Sometimes we survive because we are loved hard enough to stay. Asterisk, the fever never spread. No other child fell ill. The village, though never told the full story, sensed something in the air. An old woman at the market looked at Marisol one day and said, 'There's a kind of fire in you, quiet but burning.' Marisol did not answer. She only smiled faintly and moved on. She had no interest in declaring herself changed or holy. All she knew was that death had come knocking, and she had met it not with swords, but with steady hands and a voice unwilling to stop calling a child back into the world. The rose bush did not bloom that season. Its branches remained bare, its thorns sharp, but Marisol no longer looked to it for proof. She tended it just the same, watering it, brushing its base free of weeds, whispering to it not in desperation, but in kinship. She knew now that some things bloom only once we've nearly forgotten how to expect them. And some things, the most sacred of all, bloom only in the shadows. The sun that rose over willow fallow that summer did so with a weight that could not be ignored. It did not rise gently, as it sometimes had in the spring, bleeding soft color across the fields in tentative gold. It surged upward, swift and sharp-edged, casting everything the kind of light that bleaches memory and sears the breath from the lungs. By mid-morning, the soil was already hot to the touch, and the air above it shimmered with heat, turning familiar shapes into wavering ghosts. What green had dared to remain clinging to the edges of the farmhouse? The mint that grew stubbornly near the rain barrel, the vine that had once curled around the porch railing, had turned brittle, crumbling under the weight of drought that now stretched into its second full year. Marisol noticed the first real signs of trouble not in the plants or the land, but in the eyes of the children. Hunger had taught them long ago how to keep quiet, how to hide their needs behind distraction or sleep. But in the lean weeks of that summer, even their silence grew loud. Clara stopped singing as she worked. Leo, one so animated in the evenings, no longer stirred the fire with unnecessary flair, and Theo's shoulders hunched more tightly each day, as though trying to make himself small enough not to need anything. May, who had survived the fever only weeks earlier, still smiled but no longer danced, her limbs fragile as reeds, her laughter the thinnest thread of what it once was. Marisol watched them closely, counted every crumb in the larder, rationed every meal with the care of someone who had learned too well the difference between surviving and merely delaying hunger. She sewed patches into patches. She steeped tea from dried lemon peel and clover flowers. She scraped the last bits of flour from the bottom of the tin and taught the children how to chew slowly, as if to trick the belly into believing it had been fed. They all knew it could not go on. The chickens had stopped laying again. The eggs, once a miracle, had become memory. Agnes still nestled in her corner of the coop, eyes dim with age, feathers dull, her body now more a gesture of comfort than a production. Marisol still fed her from their dwindling stores, offering her the last of the oats with the kind of reverence one might reserve for a fading star. But even Agnes, resilient as she was, could not turn dust into nourishment. One morning, a knock came at the gate. It was the first in over a month. The children froze where they stood, eyes darting to Marisol. She wiped her hands on her apron and stepped onto the porch, heart already sinking. She had known this moment would arrive, had sensed it in the thinning silence of the village, in the way the roads had grown harder, the wagons fewer, the letters from her mother's cousin having long since stopped. The man at the gate wore the brown uniform of a county official, the sun casting a sharp line down the center of his face. He did not remove his hat. He held a parchment in one hand and a leather-bound ledger in the other. His words were not cruel, only indifferent, recited as one might list weather conditions or livestock weights. He informed her that Willowfallow had been listed as unproductive land, its taxes unpaid for more than 18 months, and its debts now eligible for collection. The council had decided that the property would be reassessed within the fortnight. If no payment or formal appeal could be made, the land would be seized and repurposed. There will be no forced removals, he added, as if this were a kindness. But there won't be accommodations either. Marisol took the paper from his hand without speaking. Her fingers left smudges on its edge from the flour, dust still on her skin. The man tipped his hat once, though not toward her, and walked away without waiting for questions. She stood in the yard long after he had gone, the sun climbing higher behind her, the heat pressing into her back like a hand made of iron. The children remained on the porch, unmoving, watching her, knowing enough in the shape of her shoulders not to ask anything just yet. Later that day, she unfolded the letter again and read every word. There was no room for grace in it, no margin of understanding. Just facts, unpaid, unworked, unviable, words meant for land, but applied now to the living things upon it. She set the paper on the table and stared at the locket on her chest, feeling its familiar weight against her skin. Then she folded the letter into the pocket of her apron and went to boil water because there were mouths to feed and no time to pause. The days that followed passed not in hours, but in calculations. How long would the dried beans last? Could they stretch the rice by adding nettle and watercress? Could they trade anything? Theo's carvings, Clara's embroidery, the honey from one surviving hive, for flour or salt or even soap. Marisol visited the village only once in those days, walking the road with a pack of hand-stitched dish towels she had sewn late into the night. The shopkeeper bought two, reluctantly. "Can't spare much," he said, "not with things the way they are." She nodded, did not ask for more. When she returned to the farm, the wind had picked up. Not a cool wind, not one with a scent of rain. A dry, scraping wind, the kind that lifted the dust and drove it into the corners of the house. It whined through the cracks in the window panes and stirred the attic rafters. It felt less like weather and more like warning. Marisol sat up late that night with her journal and her prayer book beside her, the candle guttering in the breeze. She tried to write, but her thoughts came in broken threads. Not despair, never quite that, but a heaviness that no words could smooth. She thought of the children curled in their beds, their trust in her a kind of terrifying gift. She thought of her parents, of the bed where they had died, of the ashes she had scattered beneath the fig tree that no longer stood. She thought of the rose bush, still thorned and bare, and wondered if it had ever truly intended to bloom again, or she had only imagined the possibility. In the quiet, she whispered the words she had not dared to speak aloud in many years. Asterisk if I am to lose this place. Let them not lose each other. If I am to be taken, let it not be before I have taught them how to stay. Asterisk. She rose before dawn and walked the perimeter of the farm. The land was cracked beneath her feet, brittle, flaking like old skin. She knelt near the fence line and pressed her palm to the earth. It was still warm from the previous day, still unwilling to yield. She did not ask it for rain. She only asked it to remember the sound of their footsteps. The day the creditors arrived, the sky was cloudless. The wagon rolled slowly up the road, dust rising in plumes behind it. Two men stepped out, one older, one young enough to still look uncomfortable in his authority. They wore the same brown coats, the same ledgers. They asked to see the house, the fields, the animals. Marisol walked them through it all without expression. The barn, the well, the chicken coop with its single aging hen, the empty grain bins. They made notes in silence, murmured to each other. One asked how many children lived here. She answered with a steady voice, 5. The younger one flinched slightly, as if he had hoped she would lie. And then, just as they turned to leave, as they folded their ledgers and prepared to take her silence as submission, a sudden gust of wind swept through the farm. This one was different, cooler. It carried the faintest scent of moisture, not rain yet, but its ghost. The older man paused, looked at the sky, and said nothing, but his hand hesitated over his coat pocket, the one where he kept the paper. The younger one shifted his weight, unsure, and then without speaking, they walked back to their wagon and rode away. Marisol did not follow them. She did not hope. She simply watched until the dust settled and then turned back toward the porch. The children met her there, silent, waiting. She did not tell them they were safe. She did not promise they would not be asked to leave. She only said, "Today we are still here." And that night, as the first star appeared above the bar and the wind turned again in the trees, she lit a candle and set it on the windowsill. Just one, a reminder, a mark, a promise stitched not with certainty, but with love. That night, after men in brown coats had gone and the sun had folded itself behind the line of brittle hills, Marisol lay in her bed and felt the weight of silence press down over her like a second blanket. The air was still warm, but a breath of cool had crept in through the cracks beneath the shutters, whispering against the corners of the room like something half-remembered. She could hear the children breathing softly in the rooms beyond, their sleep light and uncertain, the kind that follows fear. Outside, the house moaned in its old bones. The wind, restless and searching, stirred the dry branches of the trees like fingers over rusted harp strings. And in her chest, something fragile and long hidden stirred with it, a pulse of memory she had not called for, but which came all the same. Sleep did not come, not fully. She drifted in and out of a half-state, her body weightless with fatigue, but her mind bristling beneath it, unable to lay down its burdens. At some point in the deep night, when the shadows had grown dense enough to feel like water, she slipped into a dream. It was not the kind of dream that brings comfort or clarity. It was one of those dreams shaped by old wounds, where memory and fear braid together until they are indistinguishable. She was back in her childhood home, not as it had been in its final days, hollowed by sickness and grief, but as it had been before. The light pouring through the kitchen windows, the smell of rising bread, the sound of her father's footsteps in the hall. She stood at the stove, stirring something with a wooden spoon, the same one he had carved when she was small. She could feel the worn grip of it in her palm. Her mother's voice called from another room, muffled but kind. Everything shimmered slightly, as if behind glass. She turned, ready to answer, but the hallway beyond the kitchen had gone dark, and with it the voices. The scent of bread turned bitter, burning. The floor beneath her began to shake, not violently, but with a slow, persistent tremble, as if something massive were breathing beneath the house. Then the rooms began to empty, not by motion, but by erosion. The walls peeled away in strips. The windows turned to ash. The wooden spoon fell from her hand and disappeared before it struck the ground. She stood in the center of a crumbling home with her fists clenched and her mouth open, but no sound emerged. The silence, it was total, and in that silence, she understood something terrible. This was not a memory of the past. It was a warning, a return, a closing circle. She woke with a start, sweat cooling against her temples, the bedsheet tangled around her legs. The candle she had left on the windowsill had burned down to stub. Beyond the glass, the night remained, stretched and watchful. For a long moment, she simply sat, the locket heavy against her chest, her fingers pressed to the pulse at her throat. She knew what the dream meant, or rather, she knew how it felt. It was not about the house. It was about the failure to protect, the helplessness of watching everything you love fall to ruin, and not being enough to stop it. She rose from bed, pulled her shawl around her shoulders, and stepped out into the hall. The wooden planks creaked beneath her feet, a sound she had come to know as a kind of him. In the room nearest the stairs, May lay curled beneath a quilt, her breathing shallow but steady. In the corner, Clara slept on a mattress of hay and linen, one hand resting on her cheek, like a child in prayer. Marisol lingered there for a moment before moving downstairs. The kitchen was dark, the fire gone to embers. She did not light a lamp. Instead, she moved through the house by memory, her hand trailing the familiar lines of door frames, the ridges in the table's edge, the frayed hem of the curtain by the pantry. Everything she touched was still hers, for now, still theirs. But the dream had shaken something loose in her, a truth she had buried. That love, no matter how fierce, did not guarantee permanence. That faith, no matter how steadfast, did not shield against loss. She stepped outside into the hush before dawn, the yard silver with the faintest hint of coming light. The barn stood against the sky like a worn sentinel, and beyond it the fields lay open and bare, their furrows long since empty to promise. She walked to the rose bush without really deciding to, drawn by something older than will. Its branches, still thorn and skeletal, rose from the dry soil like the fingers of a buried saint. She knelt beside it and placed her palms on the ground. She did not speak a prayer. Not yet. Instead, she waited for the stillness to speak back. And in that stillness, another memory rose. Not a dream this time, but real, one she kept wrapped tightly in silence. The last days of her parents. The fever had taken her mother first, swift and disorienting. Her father had held on longer, long enough to understand what was happening, long enough to whisper into her hand as she sat beside him, "It's not your fault, Mari." She had nodded, not believing him, and when he died, she had buried both in the shade of the fig tree, marked the graves with stones, and left that place with the fire still smoldering behind her. Now, kneeling in the dust, she understood that she had never truly stopped carrying that fire. It had lived inside her, banked and buried, but never extinguished. And the dream, it had not been a threat. It had been a mirror. The fear she harbored was not that the farm would be taken, but that she would once again be the only one left standing when it was gone. She bowed her head and finally let the prayer come. It was not elegant. It was not even composed. It came out in pieces like scattered seeds. "If you are listening," she whispered, asterisk if any of this has meant anything, "then let this place be remembered, if not by heaven, then by these children. Let them know that they were worth staying for. Let them carry something gentle with them, even if everything else is taken. Let me be enough to hold them here, even just a little longer, asterisk." The light was beginning to gather now, pooling at the edges of the world. Birds stirred in the trees, their calls thin and uncertain. She rose slowly, knees aching, and walked back to the house. She lit the stove, boiled water, stirred a pot of oats made from the last scoop in the barrel. When the children came down, blinking and yawning, she greeted each one by name, kissed the tops of their heads, held them just a moment longer than usual. That afternoon, she found herself in the attic, searching. The air was thick with dust, the smell of old wood and time-soaked fabric. She rummaged through trunks and crates until she found what she had not known she was looking for, a ledger older than the house itself, its pages yellowed and frayed, but still legible. It had belonged to the farm's founder, someone whose name was no longer spoken. And it were not numbers or debts, but entries of weather, births, the planting of seeds, the tracking of storms. At the end of each page, a prayer was written in the same hand. Asterisk, let what is sown be seen. Let what is given be enough. Asterisk. She sat there in the dust, the words ringing in her like a bell, not because they promised safety, but because they recognized the truth of uncertainty. She carried the book downstairs and placed it beside her own journal. Two voices now, two generations bound by the same quiet yearning. And that night, when the wind rose again and the candle flickered on the windowsill, Marisol did not fear the silence. She did not dread the dreams. She let them come, because she had finally begun to understand that fear did not mean faith was gone. It only meant the heart still hoped to be spared. And hope in this place was a kind of courage all its own. The morning of the reckoning came without flourish, without storm or heralding cloud. The sky was pale and brittle, stretched tight like parchment over the horizon, and the air hung heavy with that particular stillness that precedes a decision, whether by men or by the land itself. There had been no rain in over 6 months. The fields lay exposed, bare as the backs of hands held open in surrender. Every corner of Willow Fallow spoke of this long silence. The windless trees with their rattling leaves, the cracked lips of the dry well, the rose bush standing rigid and thorn like a memory refusing to be forgotten. Even the chickens, once lively in their dusty coop, now wandered as if half asleep, their movements slow and resigned. There was no surprise left to be felt, only waiting. And beneath the waiting, a thrum of resolve so quiet it barely registered as sound. Marisol rose before first light, as she always did. But this time her movements were different, measured, intentional. There was no flour left for bread, no milk for porridge, but she lit the stove anyway. fed it what kindling remained, and filled the kettle with water drawn from the last cool inch of the well's shadow. She placed 6 cups on the table, 1 for each of them, and brewed tea from the last of the mint leaves, dried to near powder and wrapped in old cheesecloth. The scent was faint but clean, the kind of scent that reminds you of something softer than now. She dressed not in her work apron, but in the dress she had worn the day she first arrived, a faded gray calico with mended seams and buttons that no longer matched. She braided her hair and pinned it up beneath the scarf her mother had once woven, the one with the frayed ends and the threadbare middle where it had been tugged and twisted too often by hands remembering comfort. Around her neck, the locket lay heavy, as it always had, but this morning she tucked it beneath her collar, hidden close to the skin, as though shielding it from whatever was to come. The children awoke to the sound of her voice, not raised, but firm. Dress and come downstairs. Eat what you can. Be ready. They obeyed without question, their eyes wide with unspoken knowing. For days they had seen her watching the road, smoothing the hem of her apron in that way she did when her thoughts crowded too loud for speech. Theo had asked once, "Will they come today?" And she had only answered, "If they do, we will be ourselves." Now, they dressed in their cleanest clothes, worn and patched, yes, but brushed and folded with care, and came to the table with hands freshly washed. No one complained about the mint tea. No one asked what came next. By mid-morning, the dust began to rise in the distance, a fine, white plume moving slow and deliberate across the horizon, like the curl of smoke from a dying wick. It grew steadily, until the shapes of men and horses emerged from it, pulling behind them a wagon marked not with family crests or trade signs, but with the austere emblem of the county, the circle and cross meant to symbolize order. Marisol watched them from the porch. She did not call to the children. She knew they had already gathered behind her, standing in the doorway, shoulder to shoulder, the oldest with arms slightly in front of the youngest, as if by instinct. There were 3 of them this time. The 2 officials from before and the third, an older man dressed in finer clothes, his beard trimmed with careful vanity, his boots freshly polished despite the dust. He stepped down from the wagon slowly, removing his gloves as he did, and approached the gate without a word. Marisol stepped forward to meet him halfway. Her hands were calm, her eyes steady. The man introduced himself by name, but she did not offer hers in return. He held a rolled scroll in his left hand and a brass seal in the right. She recognized the weight of them, not in mass, but in meaning. Documents that turn homes into properties, names into numbers, lives into data. "We are here," he said, "to finalize the assessment of this parcel." His tone was neither harsh nor kind. It was the voice of someone who had spoken too many conclusions to linger on a single one. Marisol nodded once. "Then see it," she said, and so they walked. She led them past the barn, whose roof still bore the patchwork scars of years of wind and repair. She showed them the chicken coop, the broken gate that Leo had nailed back together with bits of fencing wire. She opened the tool shed, its shelves bare but swept, its jars labeled with what little still remained: buttons, screws, twine. They glanced, scribbled, said little. When they reached the edge of the north field, she stopped. The land stretched before them in dusty furrows, dry as parchment, with no green, no bloom, no yield. She knew what they saw. She knew what they thought. Barren, unworked, lost. But what they could not see, what they would never understand from ink and ledgers, were the lives that had grown here, the hearts that had been mended, the voice of a child waking from fever, the prayers that had been stitched into the silence every morning by hands that still dared to hope. They returned to the porch, where the children remained quiet. The officials conferred in hushed tones. One removed the second document, already half-signed. The older man looked at Marisol, his eyes not cruel but tired. "This land is not productive," he said. "You have no crops, no livestock. The records show no formal purchase, no deeds filed. There are claims, uncertain ones, but nothing binding. I'm afraid the recommendation will be to repossess. The council may allow a short extension for removal, but the decision..." He stopped, not because she interrupted. She had not spoken. He stopped because of sound. It was faint at first, a rustle, a breath, then a gathering hum. The kind of hum that doesn't come from a single source, but from all things at once. The trees, the grass, the roof, the air. It rose steadily, not in volume, but in presence, the way a moment does when it begins to turn. And then the first drop fell. It struck the porch roof like a finger tapping glass. Then another, and another. The children looked up. Leo took a step forward. Theo reached instinctively for Clara's hand. A low sound escaped May's throat. Half laugh, half cry, and still the rain fell. It did not fall everywhere. That was clear immediately. Beyond the fence, the dust remained dry. The road shimmered, untouched. But over Willow Fallow, over the barn and the rose bush and the porch and the parched field, the rain fell in a soft, steady cadence, like fingers brushing a forgotten melody back to life. It soaked into the ground. It traced lines down Marisol's arms, her face, her throat. It filled the air with that scent, sharp and clean and old as the beginning of things. The official stood dumbfounded. The older man removed his hat. For a long time, no one spoke. Marisol stepped forward. She looked at them, each of them, and spoke not with defiance, but with something deeper, something rooted. "You came for dust," she said, "but this is soil. You came to count what's gone. But something is still growing." The man with the scroll opened his mouth, then closed it. The seal slipped from his hand into the mud forming at his feet. That night, Marisol stood at the edge of the porch and watched the rain fall. The children dancing it barefoot, their laughter rising like incense, sharp and wild and sacred. Theo turned his face to the sky. Clara spun in wide circles, her arms outstretched. Leo shouted something into the wind that no one could quite understand, but everyone felt. May clung to Marisol's side, her little hand gripping tight, her hair soaked and clinging to her face. The rose bush trembled in the downpour. Marisol moved to it slowly, kneeling in the same spot she always had. The soil around it drank greedily, darkening, softening. She reached out and touched one of the branches, slick and glistening, and there, just beneath a thorn, she saw the first green bud. She didn't cry. Not then. She only whispered. You waited, and above them, around them, within them, the rain kept falling. Not as punishment, not as mercy, but as answer. The rain did not stop that night. It fell gently, steadily, without violence or wind, a baptism that continued into the early hours of dawn and beyond. The sky, once a brittle dome of silence, had softened into something tender, as though finally remembering its own capacity to weep. It did not roar or break with thunder. It merely gave itself over, one drop after another, to the land that had begged for it in silence. At Willow Fallow, the children woke not to hunger or heat, but to the sound of water pooling the eaves and trickling down the gutters, to the scent of damp earth rising like steam from the ground. The parched yard had turned to soft mud, and the brittle grass had begun to darken, a green tint returning to its edges like breath returning to a long unconscious body. Marisol stood at the window long before any of them stirred. Her hands were wrapped around a steaming mug of tea made from dried chicory root, and the last sliver of honey scraped from the cone. She did not drink it. She simply held it, warming her fingers, as she watched the rain carve its quiet path across the landscape she had come to know at the back of her hand. It moved with grace across the slanted roof of the barn, gathered in little rivulets down the window panes, and clung in glistening beads to the bare branches of the rose bush. There, beneath the thorns, nestled like a secret in the crook of a branch, the bud she had seen the night before begun to unfurl. A rose, not full, not yet, but the shape was unmistakable, its petals flushed with the pale color of old linen and first light. The sight of it stole her breath. She closed her eyes for a moment and felt the tears rise, not from sorrow, not even from relief, but from the deep, wordless knowing that something had answered. When the children woke, they ran into the yard with bare feet and shrieks of joy, splashing through puddles, sliding on their heels to the mud, holding their hands out as though trying to catch the sky. May sang nonsense verses as she spun in place, her skirts soaked through and her cheeks flushed. Theo laughed, a loud, full sound Marisol had never heard from before, and chased Leo around the coop. Clara stood with her arms wide, still as a tree, letting the rain soak her to the skin, her face tilted upward and her mouth open, as though drinking directly from the clouds. Marisol watched them from the porch for a long time before stepping out to join them. She did not run. She did not shout, but she walked slowly, letting the rain touch her without resistance, her hair unbound, her shoes sinking into the soft ground. When she reached the rose bush, the children followed her and gathered around, their faces expectant, their bodies trembling not from cold, but from the rawness of joy. "It bloomed," May whispered. Marisol knelt again, her knees sinking into the mud, and touched the rose with the tips of her fingers. "It waited," she said, "just like us." The bloom was not perfect. Its petals were slightly uneven, one edge brown by old sun. But it was real, it was rooted, and around it, the other buds were beginning to swell, tiny green fists pressing against the thorns, readying themselves for the world. The children watched as though seeing a miracle, and perhaps they were. That evening, the rain slowed to a soft mist, and the sky turned the color of damp wool. Marisol set the table with whatever she could gather, bread made from what remained of the flour, wild greens Theo and Clara had picked along the creek's edge, 2 precious eggs laid that morning by a hen who had not produced in weeks. The children helped prepare the meal, peeling potatoes, slicing onions, humming under their breath. The air inside the house smelled of herbs and wood smoke and something else. Hope, perhaps, though no one said a word aloud. They ate in quiet celebration, not out of fear but reverence. Each bite was savored. Each glance held longer than usual, as if anchoring themselves to one another. Afterward, they sat around the hearth, not because it was cold, but because it had become their place, the heart of the house, the center of their belonging. Marisol read from the old ledger again, her voice low and even, the candlelight flickering across the children's faces. She read of planting seasons long past, of storms weathered and seeds preserved, of hands that had touched this land before theirs. She did not explain why. They understood. They were becoming part of that story now. The days that followed were filled with quiet, radiant work. The rain came and went, never torrential, but enough. Enough to soften the soil, to coax green from the brown, to stir worms from the deep and call birds back to the branches. The well began to fill again, inch by inch. Marisol taught the children how to test the soil, how to scatter seed gently, how to mark rows with twine and stones. She gave each of them a task and a patch to care for. Leo planted beans, Clara took the herbs, Theo chose corn, and May insisted on tending the roses. Each morning they rose early, eager to check their charges, their hands dirty by midday, their spirits light in a way that had not existed before the rain. It was not that the hardship had vanished. There were still days when meals were sparse, when a tool broke or a storm gutter collapsed. But something inside them had shifted. The fear that had once shadowed their every moment now hovered at the edges instead, no longer the center. They had made it through. They had not been taken. They had held on long enough for the world to notice. The village, too, noticed. At first, it was only curious glances from passing carts. Then, slowly, people began to stop. A woman from the southern mill brought a basket of dry beans with no expectation of trade. A young boy from the tanner's family came to ask if he could help with the garden. Even the grocer, who once refused to spare a single measure, appeared one morning with a box of salt and a sheepish smile. "Looks like your little prayers got answered," he said, but without mockery. Marisol accepted the salt and replied, "Maybe it wasn't the prayers. Maybe it was the waiting." Word spread that the rain had come only to Willow Fallow. Some called it coincidence, others a fluke of geography. But the talk softened, the mocking ceased. In its place grew something quieter, more enduring, respect. Or perhaps not respect exactly, but recognition of what they had endured, of how they had stayed. One morning, as Marisol walked the edge of the field with a bucket in one hand and the ledger in the other, Theo fell into step beside her. "Do you think it'll last?" he asked, not looking up. She paused, letting the breeze tug at her scarf. Nothing lasts forever. Not rain, not drought, but this. She gestured to the earth beneath them, the shoots pushing through the soil, the children laughing in the distance. "This is what we get to choose." what we make with what comes. He nodded, quiet for a while. Then, you could have left, when it got bad, before the rain. I could have, she said, but then I would have missed the part where you all learn how to grow things. He smiled then, shyly, and turned back toward the others. That night, they sat around the fire again, but this time they told their own stories. Each child took a turn. Theo spoke of the time he first learned to whittle. Clara told of a dream she'd had during the long drought, where the house had floated like a boat across a sea of dust. Leo recounted the day the chickens returned to laying, embellishing it with exaggerated detail that made May squeal with laughter. And when it came to Marisol, she did not tell a story. She simply looked around at their faces and said, "You are the story." And they were, not the rain, not the rose bush, not even the survival. It was the way they had held each other through it, the way they had kept lighting candles when no one came, the way they had whispered songs of the earth until it finally answered back. That was what would last. That was a miracle, quiet and unrecorded, except in the lines of a journal and the roots of a rose. The seasons turned slowly, as they always did, though now their passage was marked not by fear or silence, but by quiet signs of renewal. The rains that had come so suddenly did not stay forever, nor did they vanish entirely. They returned often enough to keep the fields alive, to refill the well when it dipped low, to keep the edges of the world green in a way that reminded Marisol of prayers answered not once, but repeatedly in steady, measured ways. The land, long barren, had remembered its promise. Shoots had become stalks, flowers had become fruit. The rose bush bloomed not in a frenzy of color, but in a rhythm that made each blossom feel earned. It stood taller now, surrounded by a patch of soft green where no life had taken root for years. Its branches still bore thorns, but they also bore light. Years passed, not quickly, but without pause. The children grew in the way all children do, though at Willowfallow their growth bore a different shape. Slow, deliberate, the kind that holds fast because it's been forged in hunger, loss, and wonder. Theo was the first to outgrow the house, not in distance but in stature. He remained, but moved into the old loft above the barn, which he cleaned and repaired with his own hands. He built himself a bed from salvaged wood and painted a small sign that he nailed above the doorway. Here is where we begin. Clara began taking trips to the village on her own, returning with herbs, books, and occasionally news. She had taught herself to read better than anyone else, and Marisol often found her sitting beneath the old ash tree with a journal balanced on her knees and her eyes narrowed in thought. Leo grew into his voice. What had once been shouts and laughter became stories, told at dusk around the fire, always ending with some twist that left May gasping or Theo chuckling. He spoke with a rhythm Marisol knew he had learned not from books, but from listening, to the land, to her, to the sound of the house that had saved him. May remained the youngest, but no longer small. She tended the rose bush still, speaking to it as though it were another sibling, offering it bits of song, and sometimes crumbs of her breakfast. She had a softness that had not hardened with time, but deepened. She carried water with care, moved through the fields like she belonged to the earth itself. When she smiled, it was with the memory of almost being lost and the miracle of still being here. And Marisol aged. Her hair turned silver first at the temples, then throughout, until it hung like a pale veil against her shoulders. Her hands grew more lined, more calloused, the skin bearing the map of years spent pulling life from reluctant soil. Her knees ached when she knelt by the rose bush, but she knelt anyway. She moved more slowly now, but with greater precision, as though every action held its own sacredness. She no longer dreamed of escape, nor did she long for what had been left behind. She had become the still point around which the farm revolved, the constant presence that held the threads together. She kept the prayer book, though its pages had grown thin from years of touch. She still opened it each morning, not because she needed the words to be new, but because she understood now that repetition was its own kind of faith. Some days she read. Some days she only touched the pages. Her locket still rested against her chest, its weight familiar, its presence no longer tethered to grief, but to gratitude. She had not forgotten her parents, nor the fire that had taken them. She carried them with her, not as wounds, but as roots. The farm changed too. Not drastically, not in the way that cities build themselves skyward or fields vanish under concrete, but in the subtler shifts of endurance. The fence lines were rebuilt with better wood. The windows were reglazed. The barn roof, once patched with desperation, now stood firm against storms. A new coop was constructed beside the old one, painted a soft blue by Clara and May, and filled with hens that laid almost daily. The garden expanded year by year until it touched the edge of the western tree line. Vegetables thrived. Herbs climbed trellises. Wildflowers were allowed to grow wherever they chose, a reminder that not all beauty needed order. Visitors came more frequently, not in waves, and never with spectacle, but with sincerity. A widow from the village brought baskets of wool to trade for eggs. A boy from the tanner's kin returned each spring to help with planting, though his family had long since moved north. People came to ask how they had made it through the drought, and Marisol told them the truth. They had not waited for miracles. They had become one, slowly, together, and yet nothing was perfect. The season still brought loss. A late frost once killed half the herb garden. A hawk took 3 chicks in one morning. A summer storm split the old elm in 2. But these things were not seen as punishments. They were part of the life the land offered, hard, tender, unpredictable. Each loss was folded into the rhythm of their days, mourned, and then moved through. One morning in early autumn, when the light had turned that rich golden hue that only comes with age, Marisol sat by the rose bush with her journal in her lap and wrote a single sentence. I was not saved by rain. I was saved by the choice to stay. She closed the book, tied it with a bit of twine, and placed it on the shelf beside the old farm ledger. The 2 volumes leaned against each other now, filled with years of soil and hope, mistakes and mercy. That evening, she sat on the porch with a blanket over her lap and watched the children, no longer children, gather the last of the tomatoes. May laughed as Clara handed her a crooked one shaped like a heart. Theo was mending a broken handle on a basket, and Leo stood with a book tucked under one arm, watching the others with a look that had grown thoughtful, quiet. They did not need her to tell them what to do anymore. They had learned from her, from the land, from each other. She thought, as she watched them, of the woman she had been when she first stepped through the gate, hollowed, grief-heavy, carrying only a bag of belongings, a worn book of prayers, and a belief that perhaps nothing could be rebuilt. And she thought, too, of the first time she had knelt by the rose bush, asking not for blessing, but for something not to vanish. She had not known then that what she was planting was not roses, but the roots of the family. And when the light faded and the wind turned cool, she rose slowly, walked the length of the porch, and lit the candle that still stood on the windowsill. It was a new one made by Clara, scented faintly with rosemary and beeswax. Its flame danced in the breeze, a small, steady glow. Inside, the house had changed too. The floorboards still creaked. The stairs still leaned slightly to the left. But the walls were lined with drawings and pressed flowers and names etched into door frames. There were books on every table, herbs drying in every corner. The echoes of laughter soaked into every cushion. It was no longer the house that had once stood waiting for her. It was a home that had grown from her. Marisol walked to her room and sat by the window, the candle's light casting long shadows across the floor. Outside, the rose bush moved gently in the wind, its branches heavy with blooms. Rain was not falling now, but she could feel its memory in the soil. She closed her eyes, breathed deep, and smiled. And in the quiet, beneath the hush of leaves and the breath of twilight, the land around Willowfallow seemed to exhale, not in sorrow, not in relief, but in peace, because something had endured, something had held, and from it, something new would always rise.